It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. While we're going to war this week, my fellow monster fans, it's time to jump back into the Yokai Monsters trilogy. This second entry in the series has maybe the best subtitle of them all, Spook Warfare. Yeah, that's a great title. Anyway, this is the first of two films in the series directed by Yoshiyuki Kuroda. And while the series may have changed directors at the helm at midstream, all three of these 1968 to 1969 films were still being written by Tetsuro Yoshida. Now, while Yoshida did write the screenplays for each of these films in the trilogy, this was the first to really kind of seem to take its basis from a couple of published or known stories. The first source of inspiration is maybe from the folktales of Momotaro, which is usually translated to English as Peach Boy. He was born in a giant peach. I mean, how's that for an interesting origin? But anyway, he would come across demons known as Oni. Now, these Oni were marauders who invaded the land he was from, and he would leave home and his parents to go fight them. The other source of relative close similarity comes from Japanese manga great Mizuki Shigeru's Gigigin no Kitaro, which came out around the same time. Now, however, the closeness of these two sources of seeming inspiration can be a little disputed. However, Momotaro's folklore and his battle against demons and creatures very similar to yokai can be very easy to adapt into other scenarios like we see in this movie, because there really isn't a boy or a younger character necessarily going off to fight anything in this movie. So certainly Shigeru made an entire career around featuring monsters and yokai-based creatures throughout decades of his art and manga. Now, Spook Warfare is actually a much more popular film than the first film in this trilogy that I covered previously, 100 Monsters. That movie had some legitimately creepy moments and is best known as being darker in tone. And Spook Warfare does feature the titular yokai monsters much more as well. So let's get into this middle chapter of the Daiei film Yokai Monsters trilogy. Now, the movie opens with a tale of a Babylonian creature that began resting in the ruins of one of the cities. As legend would have it, the monster would reawakened in 4,000 years, but the locals for a long time would be very protective not to disturb the creature. But as time passed, the legend was forgotten, and soon people began digging up the ancient cities looking for treasures from Babylon and the various ancient peoples that lived in the area. Now, sure enough, disturbing the resting place brings about this terrible demon, known appropriately as Damon. This Damon fella doesn't really mess around when it comes to killing the intruders of his tomb. He doesn't stab them with his staff. He doesn't decapitate him, or these two guys. No, this guy kills these two treasure seekers, I guess, with a landslide, a literal landslide. That's hardcore. And what's more, as he flies over the seas en route to Japan, Damon causes a massive storm that actually topples a boat. Now, once Damon does arrive in Japan, he confronts a samurai known as Lord Hyogo Isobe. He kills him, drinks his blood, and then takes the Lord's form. And when the family dogs spot that there's something wrong with this guy and won't stop barking, he kills it with one of the Lord's samurai swords. When he then goes around and finds the altars inside what's essentially a castle, because he is the Lord Magistrate of this district, of this area. And as he finds these altars, he basically destroys them all. During all this hubbub, a creature known as a kappa is awakened in his pond and decides to go check out what the heck is going on around the castle. The kappa sees Damon killing and feeding on yet another human and starting to and that person's starting to copy the things that the samurai did upon returning home. So the Kappa decides to attempt an attack on Damon, but that Damon dude is part bird and part badass, who calls the Kappa, by the way, a filthy bastard. And the Kappa is only some sort of fish bird creature who is considerably smaller and goofier than Damon. So you can guess where this is going. The Kappa gets his ass handed to him. When the Kappa tries to flee, Damon turns the pond that he lives in into ice, so the Kappa has to run away into the nearby forest in hopes of finding some help from other yokai to bring down this Damon fella. So the Kappa does find all the monsters in the forest and pleads his case for help, but they are not convinced of this story. Meanwhile, one by one, the people in the samurai's castle and village begin to fall victim to Damon. It's the priest who explains what's going on. He knows that the Lord Magistrate is dead and a demon has taken his form. Unfortunately, he has no answers for how to kill the demon. He tells this younger guy, who is kind of like the hero of this plot, to just simply seek out a Buddhist monk. But he does have some candles that between 2 specific hours, they can be placed around the room that the daemon is in and could potentially immobilize him. But if the daemon is tipped off that our hero, Shinpachiro, is mucking about, his only option is then plan B, gouge out the demon's eyes and hope the monk knows what to do next. Now, while Shinpachiro does what he's supposed to with the candles, Damon is able to reverse the magic that the priest was performing with the candles and ends up killing the priest. Now, because the Damon wants to feast on younger blood, a family is attacked by Damon and his servants. The 2 kids are slipped out the back door to escape into the forest. Now, Damon's dudes are searching for the kids, but the kids eventually run into the Kappa and the other yokai. And the kids are able to help the Kappa convince the other yokai to fight back against Damon. They first scare off the servants that were searching for the kids, and then they pose as goons bringing children in for menial tasks for the Lord Magistrate. They then free the captives and take their places. The first to try to battle Damon is the long-necked Rokurokubi, but he ends up tying her neck into a knot. The other yokai attack, but Damon's pretty powerful, and even as a group, they seem to be completely and totally outmatched. Damon banishes them back to the forest. They decide to return, but thanks to a protection spell that Shinpachiro was trying to use against Damon, and it being knocked out of Shinpachiro's hand, it lands on the Kappa, which then, as the others are trying to help him, they end up getting sucked into the spell, and they all get trapped in a jar. Shinpachiro is successful to force Damon out of Isobe's body by shooting him in the eye with an arrow. But, not to be deterred, Damon finds another Lord Samurai, Odate, to basically drink his blood and take over his body. Now, Odate is the guy who's coming in to replace Isobe as the new Lord Magistrate. But meanwhile, 2 yokai who did not return to the castle and therefore didn't get stuck in this jar, which is a 2-faced girl. Girl has a normal face in the front and a monster face in the back of her head. And my favorite yokai in all of these movies, and of all of everything I've read about yokai ever since starting to watch these movies, which is the umbrella monster that has the one leg that goes down the pole of the umbrella. It's got 2 big spindly arms that just wave about, and it's got a big long tongue that's always sticking out. I love that guy. But they find out that the others are stuck in the jar, and they're off to seek help to get them out. Now, Shinpachiro is arrested by the new magistrate, Odate, for murdering, or for presumably murdering Isobe. Now, once freed, the yokai attempt to fight Damon again, knowing the weakness that they learn from Shinpachiro, which is the creature's eyes. But still, these yokai are nowhere near as powerful as Damon, and it's made worse by him being able to clone himself multiple times over to fight the individual yokai one at a time. Good news comes, though, when the Umbrella Monster enters the battle, followed by yokai from all over Japan, following him in almost like a procession. Finally having the upper hand, the yokai finally gouges out the other eye, but it doesn't seem to do anything. And that's because, well, it was one of his clones. They have to find and attack the real Damon, who, once discovered, turns himself into a giant version of himself. One of the yokai uses the Umbrella Monster to float up to Damon's left eye so that they can gouge it out. The clones begin to disappear, and Damon disappears into a pond where he is finally defeated once and for all. Now let's get to the 3 things I like about Spook Warfare. It's clear why this movie is much more popular than the first, and really this is where all 3 of my likes will be focused. First up, the yokai are absolutely front and center in this movie. In 100 Monsters, it was more or less an anthology following events in and around a village, and different monsters begin to pop up in kind of their own separated stories of sorts. Here, they are the actual protagonists. Sure, Shinpachiro is kind of a hero, but he's not there for the final fight. It's the yokai from all over Japan doing the fighting against Damon. Now, Shinpachiro did show them the path to defeating the big bad, but again, he was in jail when the final battle went down, and most of the fights going down with Damon throughout the film were with yokai, not between humans. So I have to imagine that these scrappy little creatures, who are kind of cute in their own way, or at least friendly to kids in this movie, one audience is over, and they embrace that much easier than the first movie. Secondly, let's not hide the fact that there is some dark material hiding under the surface of these likable creatures and yokai. The movie starts with the demon attacking and killing a very kind Lord Magistrate and taking over his body, where he starts to do really awful stuff. Where it gets really awful is when he decides that he's grown tired of always drinking adult blood. So that means he wants to drink the blood of children. So now it's becoming this really dark fairy tale type of story. And when he goes out to get some of that young food, he finds a family who has 2 kids, and the bad guy and his goons kill the parents. Those kids know that their parents were killed, right? I mean, they kind of have to know. So yeah, there's some dark business going on here that's never really stopped to be thought about. It's what makes this movie something more than just these silly yokai running around and keeping things in a really kind of kiddie level style of entertainment, and gives it something that can still be enjoyed on a more adult level. Yeah, monsters kill people. Yeah, sometimes those dead people are good people, or mostly undeserving. I mean, it is why monsters are monsters after all. Now, thirdly, I don't think you can talk about a Yokai Monsters movie without talking about the design of the yokai. The star of this movie is the Kappa, and while there is the thing about the Kappa, he's goofy looking. Yeah. He is... he's kind of got this wild design to him that just works. In some ways, you think he might be better suited as a character on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He's an underwater creature who can survive as long as he wants on land. He's scaly, but also has a bird's beak. His eyes are articulated, so they move around too. And one of the weird things about his design is that he has this flat top of his head. I mean, it's bizarre, but it keeps things interesting. The girl with the 2 faces is interesting, and I like how some people react very broadly to the second face. Practically at one point in time, there's these 2 people at the gate of the little district or the town that everything is taking place in. And it almost turns into an Abbott and Costello act when they see the girl, when one guy sees the normal face and the other guy sees the scary face. So that becomes very broad reaction to that second face. Well, Others, like the original Lord Magistrate's daughter, who ends up seeing the girl's second face, she just kind of looks at it and seems to, kind of act perfectly normal, and that it's not a strange monster face at all. Now, the most fascinating performance of all the yokai in my book is for the Roku Rokubi. And that's the long-necked woman. Now, that creature was in the first movie, but she looked a little bit more like a typical housewife of Japan from 150 years ago or something. Here, and in the first movie, that was a really creepy scene when she showed up. But here, she's given a much more almost sinister look in some ways. She's got blue skin. She wears blue eye makeup. She's always peering from behind something. She's always looking at you with almost like a devilish expression, or the way she says things is almost kind of devilish in nature. But here's the thing that I'm not sure I want to admit. There is something appealing about her. I found myself constantly looking at where she was and what she was doing whenever the yokai were on screen. And the way that actress, Akuko Mori, played her, she almost comes off as almost like a scary flirty. She was neat to look at the very least. But also, the effects work on all of the yokai designs and costumes and effects just worked really, really well for this movie. Making zero changes to anything, this would have still looked good in the mid-'80s if this came out then. There's definitely a feel and look that you can almost put on par with movies like Labyrinth or The Dark Crystal that was made almost 20 years after these movies were. Now that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're also on Mastodon now. In the Universiadon, I think is the area that we're found in now. But you can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast on Wednesday mornings and Monster Mondays on Monday afternoons at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Now, we'll wrap up the Yokai Monsters trilogy sometime later this year, but next up is another middle chapter of a trilogy, Return of Daimajin. Until next week, stay spooky.